Hi, this is Gary DeTonnecourt from morethanasnapshot.com. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about how to shoot in manual mode. So first thing, obviously you need to turn your shooting dial to M. And in manual mode, the camera lets you control everything. And there's three important things we need to control. Number one is the ISO. And that has a range of numbers, things like 100, 200, 400, 800, and on up. And those numbers tell you how fast the sensor collects light. So at 100 it collects light slowly, at 1600 it collects the light quickly. So you would use 100 when you have plenty of light available, and you would use 1600, for example, when you have low light situations. Now, the one problem with going up to a higher ISO is that you put more noise in the picture. So your general goal with ISO is to try to shoot the image at the lowest ISO you can and still have enough shutter speed to take the picture without getting a blurry image. In this situation, we're talking about hand holding the camera, not necessarily on a tripod. Because if you were on a tripod, you could let the camera go to a low shutter speed, and since the tripod's keeping you steady, it wouldn't matter too much unless there was something moving in the image that you were taking. So that's the ISO. The second part is the shutter speed. That's how fast the little curtain comes down and the second curtain comes in and closes it off. The amount of time that your sensor is exposed to light. The longer that the sensor is exposed to light, the more light the camera collects. The thing you have to remember though is when you have a slow shutter speed that collects more light, you also have the chance of blurring motion. Now you may want to do that on purpose as a creative technique, but if you don't want any motion blur, you need to use a faster shutter speed so that it freezes the action. Okay, then the third part of exposure is the f-stop. The f-stop is the size of the opening in the lens. Think of it as like the pupil of your eye. So when it's wide open, it lets in a lot of light, and when it's closed down, it doesn't let in as much light. So when you're in a low light situation, you're probably going to have to shoot with the f-stop wide open. And when you have plenty of light, then you have more choices as to what f-stop you can use. Now the other thing about the f-stop is that it controls your depth of field. So when your f-stop is wide open, you could get a shallow depth of field, which means not very much is in focus. And when you have a small f-stop, then you're going to get a lot of depth of field. So that's what you would think about when you're trying to decide what f-stop to use. Now the f-stop numbers, they run things like f2.8, f4, f5.6, f8, f11, f16. Those are some common f-stop numbers, and they're all one stop apart from each other. So what confuses everyone about the f-stop numbering system is that f2.8 or f4 is a big hole in the lens, a wide opening, whereas f16 is a small hole in the lens. And so people think, well, 16 is a bigger number, why isn't it a bigger hole? And one way you can try to remember that is it's a fraction. So think about 1/4 is a bigger number than 1/16. Maybe that'll help you keep that straight in your mind as to which is the bigger f-stop, which is wide open and which is closed down. So now that we know that basic information, when you go and shoot in manual mode, you have to look at the scene you're about to shoot and think about, okay, what is the priority in this image? Do I have a low light situation? In that case, preserving enough shutter speed might be the priority. Or are you outside where you have plenty of light? In that case, maybe your depth of field is the priority, and you can choose almost any f-stop you need to get the amount of depth of field you need. So let's say you're indoors and it's kind of dark, so you're going to need a high ISO to collect the light quickly, just to get you a fast enough shutter speed so that when you hold your camera, you don't have motion blur. Okay? So you would set your ISO to some number that will give you a fast enough shutter speed. And you'll know when you have enough shutter speed by what we call the hand-holding rule. And the hand-holding rule says that you need to have a shutter speed that's at least 1 over the focal length of the lens that you're using. Now that sounds kind of complicated, but it really isn't. The focal length of the lens that you're using is written right on the lens. In this case, this is a 50mm lens. So that means if I'm going to take a picture and hand hold it, I need to have at least 1 over the focal length. So that's 1 over 50. I need 1/50th of a second for a shutter speed. So all I would do is dial in an ISO that would give me at least 1/50th of a second. Now you would want to have a little more than that to be on the safe side, but as a rough estimate, you could say that 1/50th of a second should be enough if you're steady to be able to handhold that. Now if your lens has image stabilization, you may even be able to get away with a little bit less, but that's some experimenting you'd have to do with your camera. All right, so once you put in that ISO and it's giving you a fast enough shutter speed, we didn't really think about what we were going to do for an f-stop because we have to put that in too. And in this case, if we have a low light situation, we're going to pick the biggest aperture we can. So whatever that is for your lens. Some lenses it could be f2.8, some lenses it could be f3.5 or f5.6. Every lens has a different maximum opening f-stop. But we're going to pick the widest one in this case because we want to let the most amount of light come into the camera. In this case, my 50mm lens is f1.8, so I can open it up very wide, and it's good for shooting in low light situations because it can take in so much light. So I set f1.8, and then I set the ISO that I think I'm going to need. I press the shutter halfway down and look at the little numbers at the bottom. I'm looking at the shutter speed to make sure that it at least meets my hand-holding rule. If it does not meet the hand-holding rule, then I need to keep increasing my ISO until it does. Then I should be fairly safe to take a picture. Okay? Now if you can't get to that number, then you'll need to do something else like using a flash to provide more light. Now let's say you're out shooting in a brighter situation like outside in the sun. In this case, since you have plenty of light, you can probably set it to ISO 100 or 200 unless you have some fast moving action that you're trying to photograph. And then your f-stop, you can decide based on depth of field what you want to set it to. If you're taking a picture of something that's not very deep, like one person or one animal, maybe you'll set it to be wide open, like f2.8 or f4. That way you can collect lots of light, but also, in this case, the f-stop is giving us the blur in the background, what we call bokeh. So that's a nice effect. If you can set a wide open f-stop, you can get your image, your subject in focus, and then let the background go out of focus. That helps to eliminate distractions in the background. Now what if we were taking a landscape image and we wanted everything to be in focus? Well, one of the things you could do is set it to something like f16, which is a small hole in the lens, and that gives us plenty of depth of field for most situations, especially if you're using a wide-angle lens, which you would tend to be using for, general landscape photography. In that case, you could set your f-stop to f16, and since we have a small hole, it's possible that your shutter speed could start getting pretty slow. But if that happens, you could always just raise the ISO, or even better, put your camera on a tripod. Then you can leave your ISO at 100, use f16, and get a good image without any blur. So every exposure situation you're in is a little bit different. And you need to see which one of the 3 options is the priority, and then build the rest of your exposure around that. So sometimes the priority, again, could be low light situation, so you need to do a higher shutter speed or a tripod to get enough shutter speed to take the picture. Or maybe depth of field is the priority, where you're setting the aperture open or closed to get either a little bit of focus or a lot of depth of focus. All right, so if I'm going to shoot in manual mode, the first thing I'm going to set is the f-stop. Because I'm in a low light situation, I'm indoors and there's not very much light, you got to remember that to our eyes it seems like there's a lot of light, but to the camera there's really not that much. So I'm going to set my f-stop by turning the back wheel and going to f1.8 because that will give me the biggest hole in the lens to let in the most amount of light. Now I then will look through the viewfinder and see what kind of shutter speed I'm getting. It's set for 1/500th of a second, which is pretty fast, but when I look at the little scale at the bottom, there's a little scale that goes in this Canon from -2 to +2, and what I should do with that scale is set my f-stop and my shutter speed until I can get the little floating block to go to 0 on the scale. That spot, 0, is where the camera thinks it's the right exposure. So the first time I do this, I want to set it to 0. So I need to change that shutter speed of 1/500th of a second by turning this 4-finger dial, and I'm going to change that until my little floating block goes to 0. So it's at 1/200th of a second, it's at 0. So that is a good enough shutter speed. I have plenty of shutter speed, and I have plenty of shutter speed because I have my ISO set to 1/1250th of a second. Now what if I had to go all the way down to a 30th of a second or a 15th of a second just to get my little block to go to 0? If it went that slow, that would mean I would have to raise my ISO so that my shutter speed would be faster. So now we're outside. There's a little more light, although the sun is setting, so I don't have tons of light. So if I start at ISO 100, I'm going to first check what my meter is telling me. I'm going to set my f-stop to f4, because for a lot of cameras that might be as wide as you can go. And then I'm going to check out what kind of shutter speed I can get. Alright, I've got a 15th of a second says I'm 1 stop overexposed, so that means I can make it a little faster. Okay, if I adjust the shutter speed to 1/30th of a second at f4, I can take that picture. But the problem is 1/30th of a second is kind of too slow for this lens. Since it's 50 millimeters, I really would like to have at least 1/50th of a second. So I'm going to raise my ISO until I can get my shutter speed to be at least a 50th of a second. So I'm going to press the ISO button and turn it up to 200. Okay, now at ISO 200, I can change my shutter speed up to 1/100th of a second because the sun just popped out and it's lighting things up a little bit more. Okay, now I can take the picture at f4 at ISO 200. Okay. So my general goal is to always get that little floating block to end up on 0. 0 is where the camera thinks it's the right exposure. Now the next thing I would do is look at the exposure in the camera, check out my histogram. So if I hit my info or display button, or on a Nikon hit the up arrow several times, I'll get to see my histogram, and I'll see if it is indeed the right exposure. And in this case, it does look like it's the right exposure. Now, if it wasn't the right exposure, all I have to do is come back and change my shutter speed. If the picture was too bright, I would just make my shutter speed a little faster. If the image was not bright enough, I would just make my shutter speed a little slower. And that's all there is to working in manual. It's just about looking at those 3 options and finding the best combination for the shot you've made.
If you like this video, please be sure to hit subscribe down at the bottom so you can see our future videos. Also, you might want to check out the show notes to see my other websites like morethanasnapshot.com, where you can take my online photography class. Also, like us on Facebook so you'll know what's new with morethanasnapshot.com.